myself that I forgot to record, especially since I forgot to record in my first course today as well. So there's my emotions that I'm feeling. Feeling very embarrassed that I forgot to record again. But now it's going, so that's good. All right. So I was talking about, so sorry for those students who are coming in and watching this recording late. We've gone through a couple slides now. We're talking about emotion regulation. I'm giving an example of when I was working one-on-one with children, we would have specific conversations and plan actually specifically to work on emotions to help children get better with their socio-emotional skills. So one that we might work on is disappointment. So as an example, when we planned to work on disappointment in that kind of therapeutic setting, we might plan to sit down, read a book where in the book a character became disappointed. So we might start with that. And after that, maybe look at some faces, try to pick out which ones are disappointed. And then we might go through and play a game. Especially in early childhood, very early childhood, we probably would start with, during the course of the game, I would try to act more disappointed than I was actually. I would pretend, or I would model, or I would ask one of the other colleagues around to model that they're disappointed. And I would ask the child, hey, what emotion is this person feeling? And some of the times I would ask them when they were feeling disappointed, and other times I would ask them when they were feeling happy, or generally one of the emotions that they had already mastered. So the one that would be different would be the new one that they were trying to learn or master. So this is what we would do for one-on-one to help them start to recognize. We would try to model that emotion. And then to help teach that emotion, we would set up games where I might organize it or manipulate the game so that the child won, so they could have happy emotions. And then I might also manipulate it so they might get disappointed. So they don't land on the space they actually wanted. They don't get as big of a reward. They lose the game. So basically trying to set up things in a way that they feel disappointed so that they can then practice that. And then in that kind of therapeutic setting, we can sit and we can talk and work through and coach on regulating that emotion of disappointment. What are the things you can do if you're feeling disappointment? So first they'd be learning to recognize that they feel disappointed. After that, they'd be learning to, now that I feel disappointment, what do I do about it, or what can I do about it? So that's kind of the steps that we would take. And maybe not exactly that same linear path that I described, but that was fairly common for most of the clients. And then we would be reinforcing them as they're doing that. So that's what we would do in a therapeutic setting. But in my home setting at home, when my child's feeling disappointed, if I'm able to, so if the schedule is allowing for it, we're in a context that allows for it, I do something similar in that if he feels disappointed, I will help him work through that at that moment. An example, the other day we were playing Twister. So he really wanted to play Twister, but his arms are a little shorter than the width of the Twister board. So he's trying to put his hands on the opposite sides and can't quite do it. Keeps falling down. Tried a couple times. It was really great to see him keep trying, but physical capacity, he literally could not do it. So he was disappointed. So I was able to, because we had time, and it was a vacation day yesterday, a holiday, so I didn't have as much that I was trying to do, versus so I could actually sit down and talk through about it and help coach him through that emotion and regulating that emotion. So recognizing it, understanding where it's coming from, why he's feeling it, then what can we do about it? How can we solve that problem? That kind of thing. So one solution could be, well, we could play the game, but since he's smaller, maybe we don't use one of the rows of colors or something like that, or play something else, or take some breaths and calm down and then play it again. So there's lots of different options, and so working through that. If you're in a setting where you're not able to do that, that's totally fine though. Let's say you're in a store, you're trying to pick a cereal, the child wants Lucky Charms, but you want to pick something that's a little more healthy than Lucky Charms. The child might be disappointed. So in that setting, you might have the time or you might have the capacity at that moment to sit down and kind of work through that disappointment. But it's okay if you don't. Giving prompting, being like take some breaths, it's okay, we'll talk about this later, and then talking about it later or waiting for the next time when you can have kind of a sit down conversation. So essentially, in a therapeutic setting, we would construct situations, we would make it happen so that they would feel that emotion or work on that emotion. In day-to-day life, the best thing is model, reflect, teach as those experiences happen. And obviously, any specific time that they feel an emotion, you might not be able to stop everything and work through it with them. And that's totally okay. But as long as that's a goal that you have time, if you have time, you're able to do that. Like I mean, right there, we were playing a game, we had time. If I was doing the dishes, and we had to go in 2 minutes, so I really had to get the dishes done, and I heard the kids fighting or something, we might not be able to work through it in that moment. But trying to do it as they happen is good. But I mean, if you wanted to construct a situation where they feel disappointed, I have done that on specific things like disappointment that he's trying to learn right now. But that's more for like a therapeutic setting. All right, so with this, it's a long way to talk about some things to do to help a child learn to regulate and understand their emotions, because at this time in early childhood, they are capable of that. So the reason emotion regulation is so important is because it's really important as we interact with people. So if I want to jump on a project that my lab is doing, but my boss picks 2 other people to jump on the project rather than me, I might feel disappointed. So that might cause a conflict between me and one of my friends who got the position that I wanted or something like that. Well, helping to regulate that emotion is really important for my then interacting with my friend or my colleague who's also on the same teams as me. So learning those skills early on is really relevant to how we interact and deal with people in one-on-one settings all throughout our life. So it's not just relevant for children, it's also relevant. Emotion regulation is really important, and we use emotions a lot when communicating with people. So executive function is really critical for that, those prefrontal development. So with this, emotion coaching parents, let's talk about these categories. So emotion coaching versus emotion dismissing. Sorry, I've got a cough drop in my mouth, so I'm hissing or slurring my words a little bit more. So I apologize for that. So an emotion coaching parent will be coaching children through emotions as they see them arise. So they'll be monitoring and aware of what a child's emotions are. They might be able to predict that, oh, it looks like this is about to happen. This is how the child's going to feel. One big key component here that can be good for parents to try and develop is seeing negative emotions as a teaching opportunity. So this is still something I'm definitely working on, is viewing any kind of negative emotion as a teaching opportunity, because sometimes I am busy and I'm not able to actually coach through that emotion, but I probably just have to do a little bit better job at teaching it well. So with this, an emotion coaching parent will help label emotions, especially in very young early children. Labeling and understanding which emotion they're feeling is really useful. Coaching how to deal with that emotion, how to regulate it, what to do to solve the problems, using scaffolding, so teaching to their level. So when I mentioned the therapeutic setting, the stages that we took, that's an example of scaffolding. Teach to what they're capable of and then building on that skill. Praise or reinforcement is really good. So if I see my children get frustrated at each other and the older child goes and takes a break in their room, that's one of the things that they're encouraged to do. And the younger child, if I see them maybe take a breath and then go to hit the child, I might praise the taking a breath, right? So even if the next action was not as positive, I can still praise that positive, that try for emotion regulation. So modeling or trying to model good emotion regulation is also very important. So an emotion dismissing parent, one key difference here is that rather than viewing negative emotions as teaching opportunity, an emotion dismissing parent will kind of dismiss, deny, or ignore, or kind of push away negative emotions. saying stop doing those emotions kind of things. They tend not to model emotions and regulating emotions as well, and they will oftentimes reject the emotions that the children have. So saying something like stop crying versus saying something like take a breath and we can solve this problem. So that might be, you might see the stop crying or don't do that, or from an emotion dismissing parent versus an emotion coaching parent will help coach through that emotion. And so with that being said, you might see situations where you do dismiss emotions. Maybe I know for me myself, that's usually when I'm not regulating my own emotions well enough that I don't use it as a teaching opportunity. So as a parent or a caregiver or a teacher or someone interacting with young people, trying to do better about being a good model of emotion regulation can really help build that skill in them. And that's really important for their entire life. All right, so we're going to jump to a topic on moral development. Your book talks a little bit about Kohlberg and a little bit about moral reasoning, but this is a really big area of research that's just barely touched on in your book, and it's one of my favorite areas of research. So I'm going to go into it in a little more depth. With that being said, most of the things we've talked about so far today have been discussed in your book, but with this section and a couple of the other sections we'll hit today, we'll talk about gender identity development. We'll talk about parenting styles and go a little beyond what the book talks about. And then, depending on how quickly we get through, we'll talk about additional research on divorce and co-parenting. So for any of those topics, especially since we're going beyond just what the book is talking about, definitely feel free to ask questions. Put a comment in the meeting chat, raise your hand. As a reminder, you do that right down here. So depending on your app, it might look a little different, but we can click the conversation box and type a comment here, comment, and then everybody can see those, or raising your hand. So when I have this up, I can see that I'm raising my hand there. So just as a reminder, that's where you can interact and ask questions, or even turning your camera on and raising your hand physically in space works as well. So let's talk about moral development. The initial starting point of a lot of moral development comes with empathy and other moral emotions. So as parents foster that empathy in children, remember in early childhood, they're going to be able to feel other people's feelings, but not necessarily take their perspective. They're starting to, at this point, understand that people have different motivations, but they might not be able to take that perspective till closer to 6 or 7 or maybe even 8. So with that, moral development definition, or one, I think this is a good one. It's maybe a little bit broad, but I think it's pretty all-encompassing for moral development. So moral development is the development of the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and I'd say also habits regarding rules and conventions of what people should do in interactions with others. So in our relationships, what the culture and society says we should do in any interaction, we're learning that. We're learning and developing those kinds of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and habits. So pro-social behavior is sometimes used synonymously with moral behavior. I think at this level, we'll probably just use it synonymously. So you can think of that, the development of pro-social thoughts, pro-social feelings, pro-social behaviors, pro-social habits, things for the good of other people, and the rules about how we should be interacting with others. So a child shouldn't be, is going to be learning that they shouldn't be stealing toys from other kids, as an example of what they should do in interactions. What they should do, maybe we're encouraging them to go and help if a child is crying and see what's wrong and cheer them up. Maybe that's something that we're teaching as a group or a culture or a society, that is the convention. That's what they should do. So hopefully that gives a couple concrete examples of what moral development is. So it's the development of those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and habits related to those kinds of what we should do in any given situation. So guilt is another moral emotion. It can motivate us to be pro-social, to fix what we've done. Empathy is another big core one. So as those work together, as children are able to regulate those emotions, identify those emotions, and use them prosocially, see models of adults or peers or siblings using those emotions that way, they will be learning how people should interact with each other. So stealing a toy and if the kid cries, maybe feel guilty. They'll see that modeled by other people. They'll learn that themselves as well. So with that, again, a 5-year-old is still struggling with the taking other people's perspective part of empathy, but that's okay. So moral reasoning, this is mostly what your book talked about in relation to Kohlberg. So definitely read over those different categories of moral reasoning and the stages there. Very similar to talking about Piaget as well as Erikson. So these older stage theories were a good starting point, and a lot of what Kohlberg's applied work did to help people learn and advance their moral reasoning is really relevant. But interestingly, we found that these stages of moral reasoning aren't exactly as stage-like as Kohlberg thought. Some people might use one stage in one kind of context and another stage of reasoning in another kind of context. The people that we see as moral exemplars, so you can think of any kind of person often described as like a hero or really good person, interesting, or that people in a community vote as like the most moral person in their community. Oftentimes they're reasoning at a lower stage than Kohlberg would have expected for their age. I forget if your book has them numbered, but like stages 4 or 5 versus like 6 or 7. So there's a lot of problems with the original Kohlberg stages, but some of it's still relevant. We're going to take from what's relevant and continue on with more modern research. That was mostly what that was going into. So with that being said, at this time, Kohlberg observed that children think of rules as really unchangeable, that they exist, that they're written in stone, that they're beyond any kind of personal control. Kohlberg also observed that children felt or seemed to learn their moral reasoning based on consequences, or when asked, well, why would you do X versus Y? The child might say, oh, well, I didn't want to take that child's toy because then I would get in trouble, as an example. Another thing that Kohlberg noticed was that if a child did something like break a dish on accident that wasn't intentionally like trying to be bad, they still might see themselves as a bad kid because the concrete rule is don't break the dish. An example of that is yesterday my kids were playing upstairs. One is in early childhood, is 4. The other's 8. So they were upstairs, they were playing in one of the rooms. We had basically a poster board with a bunch of pictures that my older child's taking to school to do a presentation. So it was flattening under the mattress. So with their playing, they were really active. They ended up pushing the mattress a little bit off the bed, and it bent and crinkled the poster. So as I saw this was happening, I started running over there and saying, stop, 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 stop what you're doing. Because I wanted them to stop, because I'm like, oh no, that's going to get crinkled. But my younger child thought that they were in a lot of trouble because they crinkled the paper, and that they had behaved wrongly. They were looking at it from a black and white or a concrete, like this is the rule to not do this, versus, so they thought they were bad because they had done that, versus I was just trying to protect the poster. I didn't, and so we were able to talk about that they weren't bad for having wrinkled the poster, but that their playing did wrinkle the poster, but it wasn't intentional. So that's an example of this stage of moral reasoning. So thinking that they're bad, or if, let's say, they're playing around the house and accidentally knock down a lamp versus intentionally like smashing a lamp, there's a difference there of what they should do, right? So I might be frustrated that they broke a lamp, but if they intentionally broke a lamp versus if they just bumped it and it fell, there's a big difference. And so children at this age aren't going to understand those distinctions yet. They're starting to learn that. So having that back and forth with them is important. So with that, As they age up, they transition more to autonomous morality, and then by age 10 and beyond, they're more aware that the rules and laws are created by people, and realizing that these rules might be in this setting, but not in this setting, that they're not a carved in stone thing, that in this situation, this is what we should do. So remember that back to moral development, these ideas of what we should do in any given situation or in interactions with people. And then at about that time, so this is out of early childhood, this is more into middle childhood, they're able to consider the intentions of themselves and other actors, as well as the behavior and the consequences. So these all come into it. So breaking the lamp, what was the intention behind that? Was it intentionally trying to break it, or was it an accident? That they're learning that through interaction, through experiencing things. A lot of these are just happening through normal daily interactions, but they can be focused, kind of like the therapy setting I mentioned earlier for socio-emotional development. Same kind of thing here for moral development. You can have a sit-down conversation about this thing, but it tends to be most effective just having experiences and being able to take the time out to be responsive to things in the moment, and hopefully being able to be responsive and knowing that, oh, my child thinks he's a bad kid because he crinkled the poster. Let's talk about that kind of thing. So part of this is the experience, but another part of that is the neurological development. So the neurons and the actual myelination and all that changing makes it so they can think more abstractly. So at early childhood, abstract thought is difficult, if not impossible, until later early childhood, or even middle childhood for some children. So with that abstract thought turning on, an example of discontinuous development, so they get to that point. The neurological development is now to a point where they can gain those new capacities. I guess you could say it's kind of like a skill tree in a video game. So once they've got the neurological development, it opens up a bunch of other pathways of new skills they can develop. Yeah, it's not actually that far off for that specific aspect of development. Most things are very continuous, though. You're kind of slowly building it. It's getting better or clearer or stronger. So with this, modeling from parents, peers, siblings, models around them will show them how they should behave in any kind of given situation. So discussing and sitting down and actually discussing, well, what is the behavior that's expected here? Why is that expected here? That kind of thing is really useful and important too. As I was talking, I thought of another good example, but it already left me. So you can also, similar to what I discussed earlier with the socio-emotional development, having sit-down conversations like I did in therapy settings, you can do similar kind of things where maybe you pick up a specific book or pick up a specific movie that you then watch intentionally for the idea of, well, let's read this story and talk about sharing specifically for an early child or something like that. So you can have those specific dedicated instances of doing these teaching moments, but a lot of it should be happening just over time. So there's a lot more topics in moral reasoning. I want to expose you to Marvin Berkowitz, who does a lot of writing on moral development, mostly from a very applied perspective. So what can teachers do? What can parents do? What can policymakers do to encourage the moral development of children and adolescents and adults? He does take a good lifespan perspective. Also, Marvin Berkowitz does a good job of writing to different levels. So most of what I've read from him is his research papers, but he's also written books that are at the level of like what a parent would, who doesn't have as much scientific background as you all do now, what they would be able to read. He also writes reports for policymakers. So like bullet points of, this is the thing that you should do. Here's some references of why you should do it. But basically it just gives policymakers a really brief thing, sometimes just like 1 or 2 pages of like, hey, this is what we should do to build moral development in children. So there's a wide range of resources. If this is an interesting topic to you, Marvin Berkowitz, I think, would be a good source or author to look for if you want to get any range of information. A peer-reviewed research article for your question paper, for example, as well as outside other resources like magazine articles or a policy proposal, something like that. Maybe not a policy proposal, but policy recommendations is what I've seen from him.
The 5 things are, and they're more complicated than this, so please understand that I'm giving you the shortened version, but there's some stuff we got written on this if you want. I'd be glad to connect you to all that. First one is an obvious one, love and support. Kids need love and support from parents. Second one is that parents need to set high expectations, but there are caveats with that. They need to be scaffolded and supported and so on. They can't be unreasonable, but we do need to set high expectations for academics, for behavior, and so on down the line. The fourth one is that, third one, sorry, is you need to model it. You need to practice what you preach. You have to be the character, goodness, you want to see in your kids. You can't ask them to do it, not be it yourself, and the same thing for teachers. You have to talk, the fourth one is talk to kids about how their behavior affects other people. It's really important. You have to have those conversations where you let kids know how their behavior helps somebody, hurts somebody, upsets somebody, enlightens somebody, whatever. How does their behavior affect others' particular feelings? And the last one is
So a good example of that one. So I've mentioned you can do this in like a dedicated. So, for example, my parents, they tried to have these kinds of conversations with me and like plan them. Like a couple times a year, we'd have a sit down conversation where we would try to talk about like moral or socio-emotional things altogether. So what tends to be most effective though is doing this day by day. So as an example, over the weekend, my youngest was asking his older sibling to read him books because he wanted to read stories. Sometimes he asked us to read stories. Sometimes he was asking her to read stories. So I mentioned just in passing, in just like a 30-second to 1-minute interaction, hey, I'm really proud of you this weekend for reading books to Malcolm. So giving some praise, saying something like, it made him really happy. Were you able to see how happy he got and how he cuddled up to you and he wanted to play more after that and those kinds of things? So showing exactly what Berkowitz is talking about here, how the behavior that she was doing, because a couple times she read to him when she really wanted to go off and do something different. And so reinforcing that behavior and talking about, hey, your behavior made your brother feel really happy. It was really good. And she was able to stop even for just that small moment and realize, oh yeah, that did make him really happy. It made her really happy to hear that from us as well. This was like a 1-minute interaction. It probably took longer to describe it right now than the actual interaction took. So that's what probably should be happening just in day-by-day interactions to being responsive. So do I always do that? No, sometimes I'm too distracted and I don't focus on that kind of thing. But that is talking about moral behavior or helping raise a thriving child. Those are things that should be a focus over the course of time. Versus it can be useful to do like a specific training session, just like we did with our clients. I think a lot of the reason we did it that way is because we were so limited on time. So we only had these children 6 total hours a week and usually split in between 2 sessions or 3 sessions. So usually an hour and a half sessions or something like that to 2-hour sessions. So we would have to really focus on one specific topic at a time. We plan that ahead of time, plan activities. So you can definitely do that as a parent or a teacher or a caregiver. Probably as a teacher, having like a specific lesson or something could be really good in that sense. I think my child is ringing the doorbell. Let's take a quick break. We'll finish this up. I'm hoping they're not locked out. Maybe they forgot to take their keys. So let's take a quick break. Be back here at 10:46. I'm sorry for that abrupt break. Let's get back to this. I think we'll just stop there. Berkowitz goes over a couple other points, but I think with the time that we lost there, my flow for talking about this topic is gone. So let's move on to the next topic that we're going to cover today in early childhood development. So good to start on a fresh topic after a break anyway. So let's make sure recording is still going. Looks like the audio is still going. Screen sharing. Okay. Sorry, everybody was fine. They weren't actually locked out. My child just sometimes likes ringing the doorbell frantically. So that's what was happening. One of the challenges of teaching from home. Yeah. All right, so gender identity. Let's define some things first before we dive into this. Again, this is one of those topics we're going to go beyond what the book is talking about and add some more recent research than just what is in the book and some other examples. So, but again, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat box to ask questions, to get clarifications, things like that. So, gender identity, defined in and of itself, is the sense of being male, female, agender, gender fluid, gender queer, transgender, or any other of the numerous genders that there are. So it's that sense of being that thing, and that's different than biological sex. And we'll get an example of that in the video that we'll watch in a minute. So that is gender identity. So most children have acquired or are in this final stages of acquiring a gender identity by about age 3. So in early childhood, this should be maybe clear to them isn't the right word, because at age 3, they might not have the words to put to how to describe their gender identity, which can be a really big challenge for them and for people around them as they, because even though they have that gender identity, you could say the gender identity is there, it is who they are, it is inside them, but they might not be able to express or explain what their gender identity is if they're something other than the boy-girl what's the word I'm looking for? It's in the video. I'll remember the word soon. So again, at this time in early childhood, they have a gender identity, but they might not be able to express it. So let's watch a video that's really relevant to this and will hopefully remind me of the word that I just forgot about. Oh, I prepped this one because the intro is so long. Well, longer than I wanted, but now I've probably spent about as much time as the intro took in the end.
I have been a teacher for 15 years. 12 years ago, I had a student in my class whose name was Michael. We called him Mikey for short. By every indicator I had available to me, Mikey was a boy. Big green eyes, short curly hair, a sweet shy voice. He was adorable. He was also really smart, and he loved to draw. Sadly, Mikey had a hard time making friends and would often come to me at recess in tears. Socially, nothing seemed to go his way. Now, fast forward 10 years. I was getting into my car after school one day, and I heard someone call my name. I looked up, and I saw this spunky young woman, tank top, short skirt, combat boots. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. "I'm Mikey," she said. "Well, you knew me as Mikey, but now my name is Mandy." My world shifted. I was shocked. Instantly, though, I recognized those green eyes from kindergarten, and I reached out and hugged her. At that point, Mandy was a junior in high school and had, within the last few months, decided to live her life as a girl. But let me be clear, She didn't decide she was a girl. That she'd known for a long time. What she decided was to be and live in the world as her true self. Well, I asked Mandy why she hadn't thought of an easier moment to make the change, like going to college. She looked at me and said, Batya, I could not wait one more day. When she recalled her years at elementary school, she remembered how much she hated going to the bathroom, the boys' bathroom. How every time teachers would put students in boys' lines and girls' lines, she hated it. I cringed when I thought how my boy-girl language reinforced a system where Mandy couldn't find a place for herself. Well, her story threw me for a loop. As a teacher, one of the most important things to me is that every child in my class feels safe. Well, determined to not make the same mistake again, I decided to get curious. I began to observe how gender was playing out in my classroom, and I did some research. And this is what I found. There are many myths and assumptions out there about gender, and they don't only hurt kids like Mandy, they hurt us all. So tonight, I want to look at two main ones. The first myth is that gender is binary. What that means is we have two choices. We can either be masculine and male and feminine and female, nothing in between and nothing beyond. The second myth is that a person's sex and gender are the same thing, when in fact, they're quite different. Sex is our biology. It's our anatomy. It's that moment at birth when someone lifts us up, looks between our legs, and declares, it's a boy, it's a girl. That is our assigned sex at birth. Now, here's something really interesting that I found out. 1 in 2,000 babies are born with genitals that don't conform to the gender boxes. That's more than 2 babies a day. Just that fact alone for me blew open the gender binary myth. Okay.
That's the word I was looking for, binary. It's a simple word. So I really like this story at the beginning there. I think it's a really clear example of how, for this child, even there in early childhood, in kindergarten age, they had a gender identity, but at that time, they were in a setting and they maybe didn't have the words for how to describe their gender identity, and that the system around them was set up in a way that was very binary. So we'll talk about a couple, those will be kind of repeated points. The rest of that video goes more in depth into research on gender identity. So good to watch for that, but that story is the main thing I wanted to get from that right there. So let's do a couple more definitions, and we'll see some of these same themes coming up as we're talking about gender in early childhood. So in early childhood, children are learning the gender roles that exist. And so essentially what a gender role is, or the definition of a gender role, is the expectations that are prescribed onto how any given gender should act, think, and feel. So I've got these two comics. So, well, this is a comic. This is an ad that existed. So this is a twist on that ad. So kind of flipping those roles around, changing how any of these genders might be supposed to be acting, thinking, or feeling. I also think it's funny seeing this today, because actually over the weekend for Valentine's Day, I tried home brewing some beer, and we didn't burn it, and it's starting to ferment downstairs now. So we'll see how it actually turns out in a couple weeks when it's done with that fermentation process. But I did not burn the beer, so that was good. And before that, I didn't really understand the process of what you do, but I could have actually burnt things. So, and I'm glad I didn't. Anyway, irrelevant tangent. With that, in early childhood, children are going to be following these roles more and more. And a lot of this is just from observation. They see these gender roles in movies and books and their environment that they're in. And so with that, they're going back to Vygotsky's sociocultural learning theory, these aspects of these roles, or as we'll see, another term for this might be schemas as well, are one of the tools of a culture. It's the child is learning. This is how the culture, this is how the world does things, essentially. And so if we have it so very binary, it can be challenging for children to see anything outside of that binary. So with this, their gender identity development is dependent on biology, genetics, hormones, and chromosomes. It all influences these processes, but so do these social and cognitive factors of these roles that we see portrayed. So the social cognitive theory of gender, you can think of the social cognitive theory of learning that we talked about from Vygotsky and that zone of proximal development, those kinds of things. So that's social cognitive learning theory. So this states that gender development occurs through that observation and imitation, and this is why through early childhood, children tend to gravitate towards one of those roles and be more and follow those gender roles, because this is what the world is like, right? And they're learning how they should behave or not. They're also getting rewarded or even punished for gender appropriate or inappropriate behaviors as well. So this might be in some specific settings, it might be specifically like an actual punishment, but usually this is something like maybe they're getting bullied because they're gender non-conforming, or the actions that they're doing are not appropriate for the gender that they appear to be displaying. So parents, teachers, the wider culture, TV, peers, they perform these functions. They allow the children to see, to observe and then imitate the models. This is one reason why representation is really important, because if you don't have anything, especially at a 3 or 4 year old level, you don't know even as much as you do at 8 or 14 or 24 about gender, for example. So you're limited in what you can talk about, how you can express yourself. So even if your gender identity, just like Mikey, and then what was Mikey's name? Was it Michaela? I feel like it was another M name. Anyway, the example, the child from the example in the story, they weren't able to, they had the context, the setting, the social situations where there were boy-girl lines, and they had to go to the boys' bathroom even though they were a girl. So it was a difficult thing for them within that, because they didn't have these other models to see that there were other options, that they fit, that they were a valid and actual person, even if they didn't quite fit into the roles that they were seeing as the common or normal, or norm. So gender schema, any kind of schema, is basically just a cognitive idea, a cognitive structure, basically the network in your brain of the neurons together that give you your own idea or picture of any given thing is a schema. So you all probably have a schema of what a bird is. If I asked you to draw a bird, you'd probably draw some specific bird looking thing, but it would probably be closer to, I'm guessing, a robin than it would be to a penguin or an ostrich. So your schema probably has those features of what a bird is: wings, it can probably fly, tail, feet, right? So your schema for a bird probably fits closer to what a robin is than an ostrich. You probably have a schema of what a mammal is, or what fits as a mammal. When you first think of that, you might not think of whale as a mammal, even though they are. So our cognitive structure is that network of associations that guide our perception. So you can think of that network as being a filter that we pull things through. So we see something and we run it through that cognitive schema. Oh, that's a bird. That network got activated. We see an ostrich, we might have to run through a couple other networks to come to that decision. So schemas are a time-saving feature that we have the cognitive ability to do. So at this time, children are developing, through seeing these gender roles, through their observations, they're developing gender schemas as well. Mindy, thank you. I knew it was an M name, so Mindy was the child's name. And so over time, they're developing these schemas around gender. And so this overlaps with social cognitive theory. It's basically, the schema is that structure. these roles and what you've learned through the social cognitive approach becomes a schema in your brain. So peer influence becomes more and more important into middle and then adolescence for a lot of things. So for example, the opinions of your peers and like peer pressure, usually we're talking about that as an important thing in adolescence, whereas we don't generally talk about peer pressure at the early childhood level, because still at this stage, parents' influence is some of the most important, but peers are going to become more and more important for some aspects of development. So just keep that in mind as we go throughout the chapters. So peers might play a role here too, though. So childhood teasing of a boy who's playing with dolls or wearing dresses might suggest to them, or be a punishment, might suggest that they're not conforming in a way that the society is expecting them to, right? Or if a girl is getting called a tomboy, that might change how they then display their gender identity if it's not going to fit in with the binary that exists in many places. So I think the US as a whole is doing a better job at not being so binary here, but there still is a lot of work to do in this area. So it's one of the areas of research that a lot of people care a lot about, and there's a lot of work being done in it. So there's quite a lot that you can find if you're doing a question paper. There's also quite a lot of funding in this specific area for like grants and things to learn more. How can we help schools be more inclusive, for example? So applied work, basic research, there's a lot of area to work on this. But going back to this point in early childhood, it is seen as a risk factor. So having this kind of bullying or teasing for being gender nonconforming is a risk factor for both boys and girls. But it does tend to be gender nonconforming boys that are more at risk of peer rejection and other things. So it's a risk factor for both, but it's a higher risk factor for gender nonconforming boys. All right, so peer influence, again, this point is more about peer groups and how the gender breakdown is within groups. So before preschool and kindergarten and then first grade, earlier on in infancy and then very early childhood, there's a larger mix. There's a bigger variety of genders across the peer group. As we get into early childhood, they get more exclusive, like to ages 4 and 6, they're more exclusively broken apart by gender. And then as we get into adolescence, as dating starts, for example, peer groups start to mix more again. So there's a little bit more variety, and there's more break apart, then there's more interactions within peer groups as we get into adolescence. So with that being said, boys tend to do more things like playing sports, rough and tumble play, tends to be more conflict as well, versus girls in early childhood, more likely to engage in collaborative discourse and reciprocal conversation. So that was a lot more detail than your book necessarily goes into on gender in early childhood. I think it's a useful and good topic to point to, especially since there is so much more research being done now in that area. So there's a lot of stuff you could use for question papers there. Moral development, I've got a lot of resources I can send you for. Gender in early childhood development, I've only got a few, but if you want any additional sources, feel free. Even the APA, like American Psychology Association, they've got a lot of pages, like web pages you could use as a source, as well as links to articles that are really good too. Research articles, as well as articles written for a lay population. All right, so let's talk about family and early childhood, and we're going to focus on parenting styles. With the time it is right now, I'm not sure we'll get to our activity. I think it's going to be the same as last activity that we'll do at the first time on Thursday. So parents in general, on surveys, they rate themselves as more satisfied with their lives than non-parents, so having higher well-being, so that's eudaimonic well-being, so overall having goals for life, feeling good about the direction of their life, that they're reaching those goals, versus their day-to-day hedonic well-being. So like, do you today feel happy, like your state of happiness tends to be more variable than non-parents. So that might be because kids can sometimes be frustrating. it might ring the doorbell while you're trying to teach a class. That might be lead to more stress or something like that, right? So that kind of hedonic well-being and like immediate happiness is at a wider variability. So some parents are going to rate that lower one day and a lot higher one day than people that are non-parents, adults. So, but for the eudaimonic well-being, like having those long-term goals and purpose, parents tend to rate themselves higher on that kind of well-being than non-parents. All right. Generally, parents have more positive feelings about the tasks required for caring for their children than other daily activities. So some of the daily activities I'm going to do today are take care of the dishes that are sitting in the dishwasher right now. It's basically like right behind this wall, right behind me. It's like staring me down in the back. So I've got to do that task. I also had to get my daughter ready, get her fed, get her hair brushed, and get all the stuff in her backpack before going to school. So as an example of these more positive feelings about caring for the kids, I have a lot more positive feelings about getting my child off to school and getting those tasks done than the other daily tasks that I have to do, like the dishes, for example. Parenting quality tends to be the most important, more than time itself, and it's really important in early childhood. Parents tend to be the primary developmental influence. Then peers become more and more important. Teachers become important as well. So let's talk about a couple different parenting styles. We've touched on these a few times, but let's go into more depth. And so as we do this, I want to make sure you understand these dimensions that we're looking at. So this dimension is responsiveness or warmth. So being responsive, being warm to the child, giving them things like praise, talking to them about their needs. That's what we're talking about, responsiveness and warmth. So this is low responsiveness and warmth, or not being very responsive and warm. This is high responsiveness and warmth, or doing those things. And then on this dimension, we have control or demandingness. So over here, we've got low control or demandingness. Over here, we have high control or demandingness. So high control and demandingness, you might have really, really strict rules versus here, very, very few, if any, rules, as an example. So let's go by each of these different parenting styles. So authoritarian parenting, that's down here. We've got high demandingness and low warmth. So especially as we get all the way over here. So again, this is a range. You could have someone who's an authoritarian parent right here versus here, and their parenting is going to look a little bit different because obviously this one has more higher demandingness versus this one has a little lower demandingness, but still on the higher versus lower side. So it's a spectrum for both of these dimensions, the responsiveness as well as the demandingness. So authoritarian parents tend to be more restrictive and punitive, having very firm limits and controls, so that high demandingness, but very little interchange or exchange between a child and a parent. So even for any of these other parenting styles in early childhood, you might not see a lot of back and forth. So there might be rules that there isn't back and forth for, like you've got to take a bath a couple times, but an authoritarian parent might say, their reasoning, if asked about it, might say, well, you've just got to do it. This is what we do in this house, or this is my way. So you'll do it my way or else might be an example of something you might hear from an authoritarian parent. So from this, there's researchers who look at the predictive factors for each of these parenting styles. So being an authoritarian parent does tend to be a risk factor for many groups of children. So children tend to be more unhappy, fearful, anxious, also tend to have more externalizing problems. Externalizing problems are simply defined as something an outside observer would see. So aggressive actions, acting out, vandalism, those kinds of things would be seen as externalizing problems. I'm not saying an early child might necessarily be vandalizing, although my child was spray painting the snow when I went back there as he was ringing the doorbell. So just an example of externalizing problems. So that's authoritarian parenting. We're high in demandingness, but low in warmth. So let's contrast that with authoritative parenting. So these are easy to get confused. I might even mix them up because they have some of the same root words. So authoritarian, figure out ways to make it make sense to you or connect it to other things. So when I think of authoritarian parent, I think of like an authoritarian regime. So the house is an authoritarian regime. There's all these strict rules and laws, but there's no democracy there. That's how I think of authoritarian parenting. Versus authoritative, again, it's a very similar word. I'm sorry if I mix them up at any time. Authoritarian, I almost just did it right there. Authoritative parents are high in responsiveness and warmth, as well as high in demand. So they're setting limits and controls, but they're also encouraging independence. They have extensive discussions with the child. They're more supportive of children, and they also have more constructive responses. So an example of a rule that we have in our house here is don't pull cats' tails. Actually, it's don't touch cats' tails. Neither of our cats like their tails to be touched, so that's the rule. Don't touch the cat's tails. So that is our standard. We're high on demandingness in that way, but we try to be responsive and explain. I swear it's every day, explaining to my youngest, we don't touch cats' tails because they don't like it. We need to be respectful of the cats' bodies. You're going to get your face scratched again if you pull on their tails. So we're trying to be constructive. So trying to do authoritative in regards to that demand. Versus authoritarian, sometimes I just say, stop pulling the cat's tail. You know that's the rule. So as an example of authoritarian versus authoritative there. So with this, the authoritative parenting tends to be a protective factor for children. So most children are often more cheerful, self-reliant, have more self-control. So some of these studies are correlational. Some of them are longitudinal, so you can see some causal data here. So children of authoritative parents tend to have less stress, more pro-social behavior, and be more cooperative with peers and authority figures. So you could think here authoritarian, you've got high demands and rules, and there's like no back and forth between parents. Here you've got a warm parent who does have rules and standards and settings. These are the limits, or these are the ranges of what your behavior can be, and then talking about it. That's authoritative parenting. So next we'll go to uninvolved or neglectful. I usually call this one neglectful parenting. A lot of books will use either neglectful or uninvolved. I usually use neglectful. This one essentially is low in demandingness as well as low in warmth. So a parent tends to be more uninvolved in the child's life. The parent might be physically not present, or if they are physically present, they just don't seem to interact with the child much. They don't seem to care. If a first grader brings home their first report card, they might just be completely uninvolved, neglectful, absent. Low in responsiveness and low in warmth. So children of uninvolved or neglectful parents tend to be more socially incompetent, and you can see why this might be at the early childhood stage. With a parent being one of the primary social interactions, it's hard to become more socially competent when you don't get that time to and chance to practice emotions and emotion regulations and all these kinds of things. If you're not doing that, you're going to be a little behind and maybe seen as immature by peers or teachers a little bit later on. Poor self-control, lower self-esteem, higher truancy and delinquency. These are commonly associated with neglectful parenting. So permissive or indulgent parents are highly involved. They are highly responsive. They care a lot about what their child's needs and wants are, maybe even trying to give those to them, but very low on control, strictness, demandingness, very few rules. You could say they basically let children do whatever they want, and so that would be a permissive parent. So this is also a risk factor for some things. Children from permissive parents tend not to have respect for other authority figures. They have trouble controlling behaviors and like emotion regulation. They tend to be more domineering in social situations with peers, more egocentric, and have poor peer relations generally. So there's some risk factors for permissive, neglectful, and authoritarian parenting in many groups. And authoritative parenting is often seen as the best. So I've kind of answered this question a couple times throughout the lecture today. But with that being said, while authoritative style is generally seen as the best, a lot of this research originally was with white middle-class families, which is kind of a small group when you compare all the people in the world. So context is important. There are some specific groups that it does seem other parenting styles are not as big of a risk factor for, or maybe even a protective factor for. So as an example, it appears that for Black American families, authoritarian parenting might have more positive outcomes. So it might not be a risk factor for many Black American families or Black American children. So it might actually have some protective factor benefits. Is that due to just the parenting or the other surrounding context and culture? It's probably a combination of a lot of different variables and not just the ethnic variable there. Additionally, in the culture of the Arab world, there's a lot more patriarchal and authoritarian parenting overall, but there are definitely children who are thriving there. So just having that authoritarian parenting is not necessarily a risk factor for each group, for each child, for each context and culture. Additionally, if we look at Asian American parents, the way that we have these boxes here, the authoritative, authoritarian, uninvolved, and permissive, with just these 2 dimensions, I mean, 2 dimensions is better, or yeah, 2 dimensions is better than just 1 dimension, but 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions can be even more explanatory. So what we see, and based on these couple dimensions, Asian American parents show some signs of things that we would call authoritarian and some things that we would call authoritative. So a lot of warmth and care and concern and responsiveness to a child, but higher demands and more strict demands that we might normally associate with an authoritarian parent. So the researchers now have suggested a couple options. So basically 2 options. One is let's add some dimensions, some additional dimensions to these categories and add more parenting styles. That's one potential option. Kind of like this example might not make sense to you because we haven't really talked about personality. So personality moved from talking about personality styles to talking about personality traits. So yeah, that example is, we haven't covered personality in this class. Never mind. Poor example. So one idea is let's add more groups rather than authoritative, authoritarian. Let's have additional parenting styles added to this structure with more dimensions on it. So that's one option. Another option is, well, let's just talk about parenting based on the types of skills or the types of techniques you might use. So being warm might be one example, or being responsive might be one skill or one thing, one technique that you could use as a parent. So for Asian American parents, we would see that high responsiveness, but we would also see that kind of high demandingness in rule setting. But at the same time, they are very back and forth about, well, this is the reason for this strict rule and these strict standards. So Asian American parents don't fit exactly within authoritarian or authoritative on average. Black American families don't have as big of a risk factors for authoritarian parenting, and we see thriving children in the Arab world from authoritarian parenting as well. So these boxes that we started with are maybe not the best way, but it's a good place to start as we talk about parenting styles and what they're correlated to. So with that being said, we don't have a ton of time, but definitely put questions here. In our last class, there was some questions about, for example, what if you have one parent who's authoritative and another who's authoritarian? So if you have questions like that, put them in the chat. If we don't get to them today, we'll definitely talk about them next time. You can even send me emails after class as well. But for that one that I just brought up, if there's one parent who's authoritative and another who's authoritarian, you will probably find, as long as those parents are co-parenting well, both of them will become a little more similar to each other in their parenting style, as well as the child will be protected from some of the risk factors of the authoritarian parenting by the warmth and responsiveness of the authoritative parent. So having one parent of each here is more beneficial or less risky than having 2 parents that are authoritarian. Again, depending on context and culture and ethnicity, things like that. All right, well, when we start next time, I'll do a brief rundown of these parenting styles again, and then we're going to watch some funny little video clips from mostly sitcoms, actually, and try to determine what parenting style we see from the parents in those clips. So we'll do that first thing next time. Send me questions here in the meeting chat or also by email. And thanks for being here, and have a great rest of your day.